Good afternoon. My name is Kacia Tolsma, and I am the Climate Action Report Card Coordinator with Transition Salt Spring. And I'm happy to be here presenting to the Climate Action Network today. So to begin, I'd just like to speak briefly about Transition Salt Spring's Climate Action Plan, which is rooted in both emissions reduction and risk reduction. And the reason for this is because the more emissions that we release, the more impacts we see and the more adaptation strategies we will need. And as you can see in this graphic, there are strategies on both sides that we need to focus on, but ensuring that we're considering both mitigation and adaptation in our decision-making is really important. So for instance, on the island, especially protecting our forests and ensuring they're healthy, not only stores and sequesters carbon, but it can also reduce heat, absorb flood water, support biodiversity, and provide opportunities for recreation, as well as many other co-benefits. So that's really at the heart of Transition Salt Spring's CAP. Finding solutions that are relevant to Salt Spring, like protecting forests and freshwater ecosystems, that can build resilience, help minimize our emissions, and provide many other benefits as well. And in this way, we're trying to manage the unavoidable and avoid the unmanageable. So I just wanted to showcase at a really high level some of the other plans and regulations that happen at different levels and scales that influence the climate action that we work in today. And the reason behind this is because it can illustrate some of the areas where we need to take leadership and also showcase other areas that different levels of government are leading in. So at the national scale, we have things like the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change, and some of the implications for BC include the development of a model building code for 2020 for provinces to use. We also have Canada's A Healthy Environment and a Healthy Economy Plan, which has 64 different policies and programs, and ushers in around $15 billion in investment to things like net zero by 2050, clean fuel standards, energy efficient buildings, planting 2 billion trees, etc. And it has a lot of alignment with the provincial Clean BC roadmap. In the regulation frame, we have Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act, which became law in June of 2021, and it establishes a legally binding process to set 5-year national emissions reduction targets and also develop credible science-based emissions reduction plans to achieve each target. So you can see here, Canada's 2030 emissions reduction plan would be a part of that. At the provincial level, we have the Zero Emissions Vehicles Act, which requires automakers to meet an escalating annual percentage of new light-duty zero emissions vehicles. We have the Clean BC Roadmap, which includes making all new buildings zero carbon by 2030, making 90% of cars zero carbon by 2030 and 100% by 2035, accelerating the shift toward public transit, eliminating industrial methane emissions, etc. On the adaptation side, we have the BC Climate Preparedness Strategy, which outlines actions for 2022 to 2025 to address the greatest risks to BC. And this, along with modernizing the BC Emergency Program Act and developing the BC Flood Strategy, really guides provincial investments, policies, and programs on climate adaptation in the coming years. We also have the BC Climate Action Charter, of which the Capital Regional District is a signatory. So this is a voluntary agreement, but under it, signatories commit to becoming carbon neutral in their corporate operations, measuring and reporting their communities' greenhouse gas emissions, and creating compact and more energy efficient communities. And at the regional level, we have things like the CRD's Climate Action Strategies, which reflects board priorities and provides clarity on the role that the CRD provides in a leader on climate action. And then we also have the Transition Salt Spring Climate Action Plan. And so this is what our conversation is about today and what we will be discussing in our breakout rooms. And on that note, I do just want to briefly clarify that today's presentation is contextualizing the report card in the results from CAP 2.0. So what we found is it's important to understand that the different sectors are a starting point for this conversation. We don't have control across all of these sources of emissions like transportation and building emissions, but in the areas that we do have direct influence over, like protecting forests and freshwater ecosystems and bolstering local food, we are really working hard to move the dial. So before we move into some of the high impacts but opportunities section of the presentation, I just wanted to discuss some of the key considerations that I think are really important to this conversation. And the first is that in the near term, climate risks to human and natural populations will be more influenced by vulnerability and exposure than emissions. And this is a really huge and important finding from the most recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC's recent adaptation report. And this is so important because over the last 10 to 20 years, climate policy has significantly focused on mitigation and on decarbonization, with less political push and influence focused on adaptation. Yet now, as we're seeing different events come into fruition, from wildfires to atmospheric rivers, it's clear that adaptation needs to be a top priority and that we need to understand where our vulnerabilities and exposure lie to build resilience. The next part is that even if our emissions drop to zero tomorrow, the climate would continue to change for the coming decades. And this is due to elevated levels of emissions that are already in the atmosphere. This is referred to as climate inertia. So this means two things. It means that we need to seriously limit how many emissions we are releasing right now, but it also shows the significance of adapting now as much as possible if we're going to see the climate continue to change. Another key consideration is that in our region, multiple climate hazards are likely to occur simultaneously. So this means a heat dome and wildfire, followed by an atmospheric river and then a high windstorm. It's also likely that we're going to see multiple climatic and non-climatic risks interact, such as wildfire smoke, agricultural disruptions, COVID-19, lack of adequate housing, lack of family doctors, and this results in compounding our overall risk and cascading risks across sectors and regions. So just keep those considerations in your mind. We'll now move on to talking about the risks and opportunities on Salt Spring Island, and these are risks that have emerged from the Climate Action Plan, and this will be part of the group exercise today. So first, we have forest fire. So higher temperatures and drought conditions that create drier forests. On the island, we do know that fires caused by lightning are quite rare, less than 5%, and it's human fires that are the real risks. And so the impacts that we're seeing are on air pollution, water infiltration, human and ecosystem health, and also the release of GHGs. A report that came out from the Sierra Club said that BC's 2017 fires caused an estimated 190 million tons of CO2 emissions. Yet total emissions in the province for 2017 from tracked sectors like transport and buildings were 64.5 million tons. So 190 million tons from fires or 64.5 million tons from tracked sectors. So one of the opportunities that we have is to, as much as possible, protect forested areas and minimize fragmentation. So we want to avoid creating just small patches of greenery that can be highly vulnerable to fire. We also want to improve ecosystem resilience of public and private forests to improve their fire resistance and minimize the spread of fire as much as possible. So encouraging the maturation of trees and enhancing the native understory. We can work with BC Hydro and the conservancies to address large spans of highly flammable invasive species, invasive plants between critical hydro lines. We can work with the hospital and public health services to identify strategies that reduce demand on hospital services during tourist season when our population effectively doubles. And we can also build awareness and communication about the risk of human-induced forest fires and how fires affect watersheds. And finally, we can minimize resident and wildfire interactions. So ensuring that residents have more than one way out of their neighborhood and reviewing zoning with a view of reducing private residences in areas of known extreme fire hazard. So the next risk that we face is drought. So this means more consecutive days without rain, as we all saw this summer. And the impacts that we see are on watershed capacity and drinking water supply, of course, on our local ecosystems and animals. And we see warming of water that leads to the growth of toxin-producing bacteria. Some of the opportunities that have been identified in the CAP are really this notion of healthy forests and healthy watersheds. So as much as possible, and you'll see this as a theme throughout all the opportunities, protecting large connected natural areas And this is key for aquifer recharge and keeping water in the ground. And of course, this also helps support habitat and biodiversity. Another opportunity is to maintain permeable areas as much as possible. So minimizing large developments that use impervious ground surfacing. We also want to plant more drought-resistant crops, increase our reliance on permaculture, and use rainwater catchment for agriculture. And then, of course, there's the educational component as well. Increasing education programs on water use and wells to reduce overdraws as they continue to occur year over year. Another impact we'll see is these bouts of really heavy rainfall. So getting much more rainfall than usual in shorter period of times. And when following forest fire or drought, this can have extreme consequences like flooding and major tree fall during windstorms. So think about the atmospheric river of 2021 or the trees that came down in 2018. But the opportunities in the CAP include maximizing permeable surfaces as much as possible and minimizing the conversion and destruction of natural waterways, restoring natural wetlands and riparian areas wherever possible, and perhaps developing incentive programs for the community, replacing roadside ditches with natural water containment systems to help reduce flash flooding and landslides, so things like wetlands and sediment ponds. And we want to discourage large-scale tree removal in upper watershed areas and encourage the use of berms and hedgerows and revegetate bare slopes wherever possible. Increase opportunities for rainwater capture, especially to reduce the impact of drought conditions in summer, and ensure that new development is built with catchment and flood construction as much as possible. Another impact we are likely to see is extreme weather. So increased wind events, heavy rainfall, mudslides, erosion, even snowstorms. And the impacts that we can expect are largely related to infrastructure breakdown and trouble with our supply chain. So things like long-lasting power outages, ferry cancellations, leading to possible food shortages, and road washouts, which can have impacts on safety and emergency services if emergency services is unable to get to the area that they need to be because of a road washout. So some of the top priorities in the CAP include ensuring that new buildings are risk resilient and energy self-sufficient as well as much as possible, establishing renewable-based backup energy systems for emergencies, expanding locally grown food supplies and working in alignment with the Salt Spring Island Area Farm Plan, building a stronger community network. So we know where vulnerable community members live that might be impacted by power outages. And then also building redundancy in our transportation system. So more bike lanes, wider lanes, marine shuttles, emergency vehicles, carpooling, and especially minimizing these one-way in, one-way out neighborhoods. So ensuring that people have multiple ways out of their neighborhood. And we'll also reconsider zoning that allows housing construction in known high-risk areas. So high risk of fire, high road hazard, high risk of erosion or landslide. Another hazard that we can expect is more heat days. So more days above 25 degrees and 30 degrees Celsius, and also more consecutive days of extreme heat. And largely the impacts will be on vulnerable populations, ecosystems, and our water supply of lakes and creeks. But we're also going to see an increased demand for electricity and reliance on air conditioning, and also, of course, healthcare needs. So some of the opportunities in the CAP, again, are to really expand the capacity of pod networks to build this community cohesion, to develop checks for vulnerable residents, for example. Ensure that as many residents as possible are upgrading to heat pumps that also have air conditioning and then can also have air filtration. One of the things that we learned in the 2021 heat dome was that most residents that passed away were inside because the inside temperatures were often warmer than outside, and they were often elderly and people that were alone as well. So we can work with the health authority to develop resources and capacity to deal with these extended heat events. We also want to maintain trees and ground cover as much as possible to minimize heating and increase shading and evapotranspiration wherever possible. We'll also see storm surges and sea level rise. So we'll see this inundate low-lying areas such as Ganges. So you can see these road washouts at Fulford, Ganges, and Isabella Road that get worse. And as mentioned before, this can have direct impacts on safety and access to emergency services. And we also might see saltwater intrusion into freshwater drinking sources. So some of the opportunities in the CAP include working with the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure and also property owners to address areas of known inundation and in areas of extreme risk of ongoing erosion and washout. And this might include replacing roads with bridges and road relocation. We can work to develop storm surge buffers using blue infrastructure, so things like eelgrass, kelp beds, and salt marsh systems. And also work with local businesses to build climate adaptation plans. So this includes preparing the businesses in the Fulford Ganges area, but also helping them prepare for things like power outages, the smoke and smoke season, and also how to adapt for tourism in this changing climate. And the final impact we are likely to see is the impact of food insecurity. So in the CAP, some of the opportunities identified are to increase as much as possible local and regional food production to build our food security and reduce the emissions associated with the production and transportation of food, and expand home and communal gardening, regenerative agriculture, and sustainable wild harvesting. Another opportunity that we should focus on is to enhance our local food supply chain with a focus on storage, refrigeration, and pooled marketing and distribution. So with that being said, we're now going to head out into breakout rooms and we're going to discuss these 4 areas. So forest fires and forest health, extreme weather events, drought and heavy rainfall, and food insecurity. So I'll turn it back to you, Darlene, to send us into breakout rooms. And thank you so much for listening.